Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Landings, Humanoids, and Onboard Encounters. 10 True Cases. These are the kinds of cases I really love to explore because they're the most extensive and I think the most interesting. They're the ones that contain the most information. They're the ones that are least likely to be misidentified or misinterpreted. And they have a lot of the answers as to who these ETs are, why they're here, their agenda on this planet, and what ET contact is like, how it affects a person. So that's why I really like exploring these really extensive cases. And it's so interesting because each one of them provides another piece of the puzzle, so to speak. Some have unique elements, and yeah, they're just plain fascinating. It never gets old, not to me. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I've got 10 cases I've chosen specifically because they have something to provide to our understanding of UFOs and ET contact. And as always, I like to choose cases from all over the world. So I've got cases from England, a couple from Italy, across the United States, South America as well, Brazil, Uruguay. So really, again, a global phenomenon. I also love choosing cases that stretch over a long period of time, some older cases and some more modern cases. So we have cases spanning about 50 years from the 1940s all the way up to 1989. And each one of these cases does involve humanoids, every one of them, and of course a couple of onboard experiences as well. Those are probably the most fascinating of all, certainly to me, but a wide variety of humanoids. And as always, these cases do have evidence. Kind of always makes me laugh when skeptics say there's no evidence, because there is. And these cases have it. Landing traces, medical effects, all kinds of electromagnetic effects as well. So yeah, the evidence is there. And really, as I've always said, it's the huge number of cases that I think provide the best proof that we are being visited. Because it's not just one or two or 10 or 20 or even hundreds. It's so much more than that. So yeah, 10 cases, quite a lot to explore, some very extensive cases. So let's just get started. And the first case I want to talk about, I call Italy's first humanoid. And this is a question mark because this is what many investigators believe to be true, that this case does involve what appears to be the first report of a humanoid in Italy, but that might be overturned at some point when new information comes about. But this case is super fascinating. It took place on August 14, 1947 in Via Santina, Italy. Does involve one primary witness, though there are some other corroborating witnesses. It's got some super interesting information. What I like about this case, it being one of the first reports of a humanoid, that makes it groundbreaking, and yet, as we shall see, it echoes a lot of reports that would come later on. So a super interesting case. The witness in this case is Luigi Rapuzzi Johannis. He was an accomplished artist, and after his encounter, he actually became a writer of science fiction. However, he claims to have had a remarkable encounter with a landed UFO and humanoids while digging for fossils outside the small town of Raveo, very near Via Santina in Italy. So this all began one morning when he hiked up a small valley along the mountain stream Chiarzo. He hiked to the foothills of the Carnio del Col Gentile mountain, and this is when he saw a, quote, large lenticular object of a vivid red color. So being nearsighted, he immediately put on his glasses and saw that this object was in fact a metallic disc with a cupola on top and what appeared to be an antenna. He had never heard of flying saucers, which at this point had not yet reached the Italian media. But he saw this object, which was actually kind of stuck in a cleft of rock at a 45-degree angle, but quite large. He says about 30 feet wide. It was not that far away from him, just up over the stream. So he decided to climb up to it and get a closer examination. But the first thing he did was look around to see if there was anybody else in the area who might also be seeing this thing. And this is when he noticed what he first thought were two young boys. He actually shouted at them, pointed out this disc to them. And as he began to walk towards it, he stopped because he realized that these were not two boys. These were two short humanoids. As Luigi says in his own words, the two boys were dwarfs, the likes of which I had never seen nor even imagined. They were coming towards me slowly with tiny strides, with their hands at their sides and their heads motionless. When they had come to a few paces from me, they halted. I had no strength left. I seemed to be paralyzed or to be dreaming, but I was still able to observe them in every detail. They were no more than 90 centimeters in height. That's about 3 feet. And he says, they were wearing dark blue colored overalls made of some material that I would not know how to describe. Translucent is the only term for it. They had collars and rather deep belts, all of a vivid red color. Even the cuffs and the shins of the legs ended in collars of the same type. The heads were bigger than the head of a normal man. So these are details we often see. Short little humanoids wearing full body overalls, and the fact that he's paralyzed, unable to move. All of this are details that we often hear in these close encounter reports. He said that these beings were wearing tight-fitting caps. Their skin complexion was sort of an earthy green. They had small, straight noses, just a slit for a mouth, and eyes that he said were, quote, enormous, protruding, and round, with what looked like vertical pupils. So he was absolutely astonished and did have some fear at this point. He watched them, he estimates, for about 2 minutes. At this point, he was able to raise his pick, which he used for digging fossils, and he shouted out, asked them who they were, where they come from, and do they need assistance. And he thinks they may have been threatened by the way he lifted his pick, because at that point, one of the figures reached down to his belt, and suddenly a beam or a ray came out and struck Luigi. As he says, before I had time to move or do anything, I found myself laid out, full length on the ground. My pick shot out of my hand as though snatched by an invisible force. Now, prior in life, Luigi had once received an electric shock. And he said that's how it felt, like a violent electric shock. So at this point, he's truly unable to move, and he watched these two figures approach him. They came right up to him. One picked up his tool, and this is when Luigi saw that the being's hand had what looked like 8 claws, 4 on each side. He also said that the ETs appeared to be panting, breathing heavily. Now, with great effort, he was able to sit up, and he watched these figures return into the craft, and it was just a few minutes later that this craft took off. At this point, as it took off, Luigi says he was struck by a blast of wind, which was strong enough to roll him over. So the craft is gone. Afterward, he felt weak and trembling. He looked around for his pick, could not find it. Apparently it was taken by the ETs. Now there are some accounts where the reporters say that he was actually painting and the ETs took his easel. But according to Luigi's first-hand report, he does not mention this at all. He says they took his pick. So needless to say, he cut his hike short and left. But he did return, and he went directly to bed early, but returned the next day and was unable to find any evidence of where this craft had landed. He did inquire about the village of Raveo, asking people, and he found 2 different sets of witnesses who had actually seen a red craft on the same morning he had his encounter. So at the time of this encounter, again, he'd never heard of UFOs, and he kept wondering if this craft and the beings he had encountered were from a foreign country on Earth. But he knew it was an unusual encounter. He was very reluctant to talk about it, and he actually kept it secret for a while. As he says, "I had no wish to be considered a crazy visionary, or worse, and I don't think anyone could blame me." But it was some weeks later he had an opportunity to travel to the United States. And at that time, this was just after the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the Roswell crash. In fact, there was a huge superwave of UFO activity going on. And it was all over the newspapers. And he heard about it, including the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the Roswell UFO crash. And this is what encouraged him to come forward and share his experience with researchers. And being an artist, he was able to provide sketches of the beings, the craft he saw. And for a long time, he believed that these were biological beings, but later he speculated that they might in fact be robotic. Gordon Creighton, who was the editor of the Flying Saucer Review, and certainly a well-respected and pioneering researcher, he calls this case, quote, "an important early contact claim. I find it very difficult indeed not to take this story seriously, and those to whom I have shown it have been struck by many points that seem to have the authentic ring of truth." So yeah, it's got many details that we see in these modern day accounts, and it is believed by many to be Italy's first modern account of a humanoid from a UFO. So yeah, there's a lot to like about that case. The fact that the witness was an accomplished artist and was able to provide detailed sketches of the humanoids he saw, that's fascinating. And the details he describes are so similar to modern day reports of humanoids, which I think lends a level of credibility. Like many witnesses, he did not want to talk about it, but finally felt compelled to come forward. Yeah, an amazing case on a lot of different levels. And moving along to the next case, which is super interesting, and another one, as it turns out, from Italy. I call this one a UFO in trouble, and it took place on April 24, 1950 in Varese, Italy. And what I like about this case is while it is a single witness case, it was very thoroughly investigated. It involves some pretty intense evidence in terms of medical effects, landing traces, and apparently some actual physical evidence, metal fragments, which were studied in a laboratory and had some results that I think were not expected. But certainly an important case that received a lot of attention at the time. This case was investigated by Italian researcher Antonio Giudici, and it involves an apparent UFO landing to make repairs, which is quite rare. In fact, as researcher Gordon Creighton writes, and I quote, "So far as we recall, there have been only a few cases in which UFO percipients claimed to have observed entities walking around a landed craft and seemingly inspecting the hulls. Rarer still are the cases where it is claimed that actual repairs were being carried out. Here is a remarkable story involving, as we may speculate, an object which may have been damaged in a storm, and metallic material is alleged to have been left by the occupants of the UFO." So, there had been a storm that day in Varese, Italy, April 24, 1950. It was around 10 p.m., and the main witness, Bruno Facchini, who was a 42-year-old worker at an industrial firm, he was in his home on the outskirts of a little town called Abbiate Guazzoni. This is in Varese, Italy, and he just stepped out for a breath of fresh air. And this is when he saw strange flashes of light in front of his house. And he thought, is this lightning? Is this perhaps electrical lines that had been damaged in the recent storm? So he decided he was going to go inside and put on his boots and go investigate. So he did, and went outside and didn't see anything at first and was returning to his house, and this is when he saw these strange flashes of light again. So he hiked back out into this field next to his home, and he was shocked to see a very large craft, shaped kind of like a flattened sphere, sitting in the field on the ground. And he saw a little ladder along the side with a green light on top, what looked like a little sort of device to get up to the craft, sort of like scaffolding. And getting closer, he saw this strange figure who was on the scaffolding and appeared to be performing a welding job on the dark craft. And looking at this figure, Bruno could see that he wore what looked like a diving suit and a mask, as you can see in this illustration. And as Bruno says, "My curiosity now aroused, I stepped closer and now saw two other individuals, likewise in diving suits and masks, moving about very slowly around the machine, which caused me to think that the suits they were wearing must be very heavy for them. The machine, which was of a dark color, showed metallic reflections when lit up by the flashes coming from the welder." So not too far away there was an airport, the La Malpansa airport, and he thought that perhaps there had been a forced landing of an aircraft. So he told these ETs, these men, he thought, that his house was nearby and did they need help. And I'll just let Bruno describe what happened next. As Bruno says in his own words, "The only reply I got were some incomprehensible guttural sounds. I tried to guess what their intentions were, and I got the impression that they wanted to invite me to get up into the machine. I then heard a noise like the sound of a gigantic beehive or a big dynamo, and I saw inside another ladder going up, and all around on the walls, tubes, cylinders, and gauges. In that precise moment, I realized that it couldn't be an aircraft, and I was seized by a sensation of panic and fled." So he says that these figures did look entirely human, could easily pass on Earth for normal people, but realizing that they weren't, he became afraid and started to run away, and he could hardly believe what happened next. And as Bruno says, again in his own words, "After I had run a few paces, I turned around and saw one of the pilots grab a sort of camera that he was carrying around his neck and shoot a beam of light at me. I carried on running, and simultaneously I had the impression that I had been struck by a blunt instrument, or to put it better, by a powerful jet of compressed air, and I fell to the ground. It seemed as though they were no longer interested in me. I got the impression that they had wanted to punish me for my disobedience, but I was sure that they did not desire to do me any harm." So yeah, this is another case of someone being struck by a beam of light, probably, I suspect, but rendered him unable to move or approach these figures. He was still fully conscious, and Bruno watched as the figure who was doing the welding came down, picked up some equipment that was next to this craft. At this point, all the figures returned into the craft and closed the door. All the lights on the craft were extinguished, and according to Bruno, the buzzing sound increased, and the object rose at, quote, "fantastic speed and vanished into the darkness." So Bruno, he was stunned, amazed, confused. He stumbled back into his home and couldn't get any sleep at all that night. He stayed up all night. In the morning, he returned to the spot, and this is when he found some strange evidence. As Bruno says, "I saw some marks there. Not very visible, however, as the soil of the meadow, which was under grass, was pretty hard. But the marks consisted of 4 round impressions about 1 meter in diameter and set in a square, about 6 meters apart. I also noticed burnt grass and a few bits of metal, which I picked up." So Bruno was pretty sure that these metal pieces were from the apparent UFO repair job. So he picked them up and actually had them sent out for analysis. And the analysis came back as quite surprising. Turned out to be leaded bronze. And seemingly terrestrial, though Bruno was told by the analyst that this was, quote, an anti-friction metal. So disappointing that this was not more strange, but hard to say. Metal is same all over the universe, perhaps. At any rate, following this encounter, Bruno did report the event to the police, who he says conducted a very thorough investigation. And in fact, he ultimately regretted going public, Bruno did, because the police would not stop questioning him, just interrogated him endlessly, he said. And then following that came hordes of curiosity seekers and journalists who he said often misrepresented his encounter. So ultimately, he wished he had never talked about it. As he says, if I'd have known all that was coming, I'd have kept jolly quiet about it. And this was an encounter that would affect him for the rest of his life. In fact, in the days following the encounter, Bruno had back pain where he was struck by the beam of light, and he noticed that his skin looked blackened. But as Bruno says, I have never got over the shock that I suffered. Even today, years after, from time to time, I feel hot flashes on the face without any signs of fever. I really feel for that witness, Bruno Ficini, and the fact that he regrets coming forward is not surprising to me. Makes me wonder just how many people do not come forward. I suspect it's the majority of them. But he did, and I'm glad he did because it's an important case. It's got a lot of evidence to it. I think there's some very interesting elements to it. The fact that they were human-looking ETs is also super interesting. I love those kinds of cases. The grays, the so-called grays, get so much attention, but the fact is there's all different types of humanoids, but all humanoids, more alike us, as I've said many times, than different. And now we move to the next case, which is quite brief, but I think important. I call this case, Entities Examine a Factory. And we don't have the exact date for this one, but it's sometime in 1967 and took place in Goshen, Indiana. And what I like about this case is it shows a pattern of UFO activity that we often see. This case was reported to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, by an anonymous witness who was a supervisor at a factory in Elkhart County, again in Goshen, Indiana. Now, he was not the first witness, actually. He was inside working when a fellow employee who was on a break called him to come outside and look at something in the sky that was approaching the factory from the northwest. And I'll just quote the witness directly because he describes what happened next in good detail. As the witness says in his own words, due to bright security lights, we could not see the whole shape of what was a craft. What we did see was part of a circle with solid windows or openings in it. There was a red background light inside the craft. While we watched, we could see several silhouetted figures moving about. One was looking over the craft edge and appeared to be looking in our direction. The window that the figure was looking down from was sloped out at the top and bottom, forming a V shape. Whatever it was moving along at a leisurely pace of approximately 10 miles per hour and approximately 200 to 300 feet from the ground. I could see that as it floated along, it did not have a smooth movement, but seemed to wobble on its axis. The vehicle was moving silently towards the southeast. All of this took place after 8 p.m. It was dark outside, and we were unable to determine the size of the craft. I have kept this pretty much to myself over the years due to the jibbing that I had received for even mentioning it. I have always been a structured type of individual and tell things as they are. I have given the approximate dates on the sighting as I had never written this event down. But P.S. the window that the figure was looking down from was sloped out at the top and the bottom forming a V shape. So there you go, a very strange encounter. I think it's significant that he's reporting this craft, which was quite low again, did not have smooth movement, but was wobbling. And this is something we do see with, I think, what are genuine encounters. I wish you got a better look at these silhouetted figures, because we don't know what they look like. And this case has apparently never been fully investigated, yet it remains an intriguing report, not only because it was a low-level, multi-witness encounter involving humanoids, but because of the fact that it moved directly over a factory. And this is something that has long been noticed. UFOs are attracted to technological installations. It's unfortunate that case wasn't more thoroughly investigated, but it is a multiple witness case. That's significant. But I bet that there are probably other witnesses out there. But as I said, this is an important case because it shows, once again, that ETs have a penchant for hovering over technological installations. And I suspect that's exactly what was going on here. A super interesting case. And now we move to the next one, which I call ETs at Sea. This one took place on June 27, 1970 in Rio de Janeiro. This is in Brazil, of course. And what I like about this case is it's a daylight case. It's very long lasting. I think it's about an hour. Also, many witnesses, an entire family, as well as a Brazilian police officer. This case was professionally investigated as well, so that is important and has some super interesting elements to it, and of course, humanoids. This case involved at least 8 witnesses, 7 who lived at 318 Avenida Niemeyer in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and 1 who lived next door at 210 Avenida Niemeyer. So this location actually affords them a very close-up view of the coast. And we know exactly who the witnesses are. The witnesses were Aristu Machado, his wife Doña Maria Nazar Machado, their 5 children, and their friend Senor João Aguiar, who is a member of the Brazilian Federal Police. And all of them were out on the Machado's veranda overlooking the ocean, playing games, eating. It was just before noon, and it was Aristu who first noticed a craft of some kind throwing up spray on the ocean's surface. So apparently it had just come in for a landing, though this was not specifically seen, but it was throwing up quite a volume of water. They first thought it actually might be a motorboat in need of assistance. But of course later it would become clear to them that this wasn't a motorboat at all. Whatever it was about 15 feet wide, gray metallic and in color, and it had this large transparent dome, a cupola, on top. And inside of this dome, they could see 2 thick-set small men wearing shining clothing and helmets. And it was weird because these 2 men were signaling with their arms. So all the witnesses were looking at this. It was immediately apparent to them that this was unusual. They began discussing the incident, trying to figure out what they should do. Now this object was quite close to shore. Estimates are somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 feet. At one point much closer, as close as 300 feet. But Senor Aguiar, the neighbor, decided he would go leave the location to notify authorities. And when he returned 40 minutes later, this craft was still there. All the witnesses were still watching it, but it was shortly after he returned, this disc, without warning, suddenly took off. First gliding on the ocean, and then becoming airborne, climbing at a 45-degree angle and going off into the distance. And of course, this is when they could now clearly see this was a classic flying saucer. And they said as this thing took off, the lights on the craft began flashing in sequence, multicolored lights, green, yellow, and red. And it was Doña Maria who noticed a strange sort of design on the bottom of the craft, as you can see here. She also said that she could still see the two figures in the craft, in the dome, as this object went airborne. But at no time did this thing make any noise, not that they could hear. Now, when this craft left, it had apparently left behind an object described as a white, hoop-shaped object. It was quite small, only a few feet in diameter. And they're trying to figure out what it was when it disappeared beneath the waves. It then reappeared, and as they watched, something strange happened. This hoop-shaped object ejected a yellow oval object, smaller, only about 1.5 feet wide. And this yellow object began to move deliberately in a controlled way towards the beach. They then saw, this is so weird, a green object detach from it and follow behind it. And this yellow object approached to about 360 feet from the shore. And then it made a right angle turn to the left and seemed to continue up the coast, which, by the way, is contrary to the current. Meanwhile, this white hooped object continued to sink and rise back up several times before finally disappearing. So a really strange case that has never been fully solved. And as it turns out, this area has produced a number of reports over the years, but this was apparently the first to involve humanoids. This case was investigated by researchers Irene Granchi, a very well-known researcher, and Walter Buehler. But no conventional explanation has ever been found to explain what these witnesses saw. What's cool about that case is they got to see this UFO, or technically a USO, very close up. Didn't immediately jump to the ET explanation. That's something they were quite resistant of until this craft actually flew away at a 45-degree angle into the skies silently. Yeah, a really fascinating case with so many witnesses, so long lasting, very close up, seen during the day. And now we move to the next case, which I call the Virginia Giant. That's actually how the case came to be known as. It's a pretty well-known case, but I am not sure how many of you have heard of it. It certainly deserves to be more well-known. It was investigated by NICAP, actually, investigators from the National Investigative Committee of Aerial Phenomena. It took place on May 16, 1971 in a little town in Virginia called Passapatanzi. This is outside of Fredericksburg. And an unusual case in a number of ways because of the follow-up of what happened, the aftermath of this case. This case was investigated by researchers John Carlson and Bruce Maccabee, who's a very well-known researcher. They described it as, quote, one of the most interesting cases that they have worked on for NICAP, the National Investigation Committee of Aerial Phenomena. And as I said, this case has come to be known as the Virginia Giant, and we shall see why. The main witness is an 18-year-old high school student known only as Michael D. He and two of his high school friends, Bill and Dave, had decided to go camping about 1.5 miles from their home in rural Passapatanzi, outside of Fredericksburg. They had found a nice spot in a field next to a pond surrounded by forest. With them, and this is significant, was Mike's pet German Shepherd. So they pitched their tent and were exploring the surrounding terrain when they heard this horn coming from a house on a ridge overlooking the field. It wasn't too far away. Curious, Bill and Dave decided to hike to the edge of the field to investigate, while Mike stayed behind with his dog. And this is when his encounter actually began. As Mike says in his own words, I felt like something was following me, and I turned around and there wasn't anything there. In a split second, I turned around again, and there was this huge object, just like it was floating. According to Mike, this object was hovering over the power lines by the pond and then began to move in his direction. And when he saw this, Mike immediately lay down in the high grass with his dog, trying to hide. The object approached to about 100 feet away from Mike and came in for a landing. As Mike says in his own words, legs came out from under it and it bounced as it hit the ground. I couldn't move. I was stunned. I kept watching it, and finally a door came down. Finally, I saw this man. He had long arms and everything. Finally, he started walking. He looked around. He had some type of object in his hand. I don't know what it was. Like a small little box that was glowing. He looked at me, put his hands up, and started to come at me. Finally, I just told my dog to sick him, and he went after him. So this apparent ET, who Mike described as, quote, powerfully huge, apparently saw Mike's dog, who was now snarling and approaching the figure. So when this happened, the figure turned around and, walking in sort of a stiff, bouncing gait, returned inside the craft. The object remained on the ground for another 10 minutes or so and then took off. So Mike was absolutely stunned by this encounter to the degree that when his friends Bill and Dave returned, they found Mike lying down in the grass, moaning and clearly frightened. He quickly told them what happened, pointed to where the craft had left over a nearby hill. And Bill and Dave looked, and they could see a strange glow there that was not normal. All three of them at this point became so frightened, they decided to cut their camping trip short, and they returned home, purposefully avoiding that hill where the light was still glowing. But as it turns out, events were still in progress, because it was 2 nights later, on May 18, that Mike's 2 sisters, Kathy, age 18, and Susie, age 14, were returning home. And they were driving up the family's driveway, which is quite long, when they heard this strange humming noise. And they saw a red light coming down around them from above. It was at that exact moment the car stalled, the headlights went out, the radio quit. So they became quite frightened at this point, and they tried frantically to start the motor, but of course it wouldn't go on. Meanwhile, they're looking up, and they can see this huge disc-shaped object, glowing white, with 4 red lights on the underside, and it was so low. They estimate it was only about 50 feet above their vehicle. And it was just staying there. This standoff lasted for about 5 minutes, when finally the car started, the girl raced up the driveway, and the object actually followed them. Now, their brother Mike, the original witness, was in the house at the time, and he heard the car roaring up the driveway, kicking gravel from the gravel driveway. So he rushed outside, and he saw this, quote, gigantic saucer-shaped thing following them. So once they pulled up to the house, Kathy, who was driving, immediately fled inside. But poor 14-year-old Susie remained in the car, too frightened to move. Meanwhile, Mike's older brother came running out. He also saw the object. Kathy ran inside to call their parents. Their parents were not far away. They rushed home, but before they could arrive, the object had begun to move. However, the father was able to use a pair of binoculars, and he watched the object through the binoculars as it moved away and was gone. Also, another weird, interesting electromagnetic effect. The whole time the saucer hovered, the TV in the house was not functioning normally. So everyone was quite shook up by this. They called the police. This is when Mike explained about his prior sighting in a nearby field 2 days earlier. So the police and 2 members of his family went to the location, and this is when they found 7 evenly distributed holes in a circular pattern. The investigators were quite impressed by the sincerity of the witnesses, how emotional they were, and they studied the case. They interviewed all the witnesses in detail, who were quite concerned about publicity and their identity being kept secret. But what they did find was that about 30 miles away, less, was the Naval Weapons Laboratory at Dahlgren. They thought this might be a factor because, as we know, UFOs do seem to be very interested in military installations. So there you go. What's interesting about this case is this UFO is apparently following this family, or certainly at least the primary witness. It's also interesting because it involves landing traces, as well as electromagnetic effects, as well as animal reactions. It's a super interesting case. I do wonder if the UFO was there because of the Naval Weapons Laboratory not too far away at Dahlgren. Certainly a possibility, but it seems like it was more interested in the witness himself. Super hard to say. I wish that this was more thoroughly investigated in terms of a follow-up, because I suspect this wasn't a one-off. There being two encounters one day after the other. But unfortunately, this case has sort of faded off into history, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to present it here, because it definitely deserves to be well known. And now we move on to another super fascinating case, which I call ETs on the island of fur seals. This took place on October 28, 1972, on a little island off the coast of Uruguay. This is called the Isla de Lobos, which translates to the island of fur seals, meaning Lobos Marino, which is how you say fur seals. So it's a fascinating case on a very isolated island with a little lighthouse on it, a little military outpost. I definitely wonder what the ET craft was doing there. But as we shall see, it's a very close encounter with a landed UFO and humanoids. This very interesting case was investigated by Dr. Willie Smith, PhD, a physicist and a UFO researcher from the University of Michigan. This case took place on a remote island, again right off the coast of Uruguay. And it's called the Isla de Lobos because this island is really only inhabited by fur seals. Besides them, there is a lighthouse, which is maintained and occupied generally by 4 or 5 officers from the Uruguayan Navy. And on this night, there were 5 officers there. There was Corporal Juan Fuentes Figueroa, Jose Gomez, and Hector Jimenez. They were 2 enlisted men. There was Jose Lima, the telegraph operator, and Francisco Cascudo, who was the sub-officer. And it was about 10:10 p.m. The men had just finished dinner, they were playing cards, and it was time for Corporal Juan Fuentes to go inspect the generators at the bottom of this 66-foot tall lighthouse you can see here. So he walks up to this lighthouse, and this is when he sees some strange lights. And realizing they were unusual, he ran back inside, got his pistol, and went to investigate. And getting closer, he saw that these lights were actually coming from an object which had landed on the terrace. It was very unusual looking. It had white, yellow, and purple lights. And as he got even closer, he saw that there was in fact a figure standing next to it, and then a second and a third figure coming out from the craft. And almost immediately, these 3 figures noticed Corporal Fuentes. They seemed to briefly consult each other and then turned to face him. And he says they looked like normal humans. He couldn't really see that well because it was dark and they were mostly silhouettes. But he saw that they were about 5 feet tall, 2 of them. One was closer to 6 feet. He says they appeared to be wearing heavy black rubber suits, which kind of restricted their movements. So they also appeared to have elongated heads, though he's not sure if this could have been due to a helmet or a hood of some kind. But it was the craft which really caught his attention because it was a classic saucer. Metallic red, a dome on top, long landing legs. And at this point, he was about 80 feet from the craft. That's pretty close. And realizing that whoever this was, they were intruders, they were not supposed to be there, it was his job to defend this installation, and he raised his gun. He intended to shoot, but for reasons not fully understood by him, he found himself unable to do so. He says he felt a strange vibration, his hair lifted on end. He felt as if he was paralyzed. He felt mentally confused. He says he received what was apparently a telepathic communication, which, as he told researchers, was, quote, "Don't shoot because it is useless." So again, these are details we often hear. People describe their hair standing on end, strange vibrations, being paralyzed, receiving telepathic messages. But as all of this is going on, these three figures quickly re-entered the craft using the same ladder-type device they had descended on. And after they entered, he watched this door close sideways, and this craft moved straight up, emitting a humming sound. And once it was about 140, 150 feet in the air, he says it emitted sort of this blast of fire from the bottom section and disappeared at extremely high acceleration, but totally silently to the southeast. So this really impressed him, somewhat traumatized him. He returned to the building with the other officers still in it playing cards, and they noticed he was very pale. Something was wrong, and they asked him what happened, and he told them. And they thought he was joking. Pretty much all of them thought he was joking, except one, Officer Cascudo, who believed Fuentes and said that Fuentes was, quote, "a simple and honest man, incapable of inventing a story of this nature." But it really upset Fuentes that the others didn't believe him. He planned to go to the newspapers to report his experience. However, before this, he was actually ordered to describe his experience to a higher-ranking officer. And he learned that the U.S. military at the American embassy there were interested in his story and did receive all the details about it, which I think is significant. A truly interesting case. I don't think it was helicopters. It's quite clear that the U.S. was also very interested in this case, given that this report apparently went to the Pentagon. So something is going on there if they're interested in it. A fascinating case, to say the least. And now we move on to the next case, which I call "It Can't Be Human." This is, of course, a direct quote from the primary witness. It took place on October 24, 1974 in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a super fascinating case because it's an object and humanoid that was seen very close up, landed on the ground for a good period of time. There's landing traces, there's electromagnetic effects, and a very unusual humanoid. This case was investigated by very well-known researcher Leonard Stringfield, and it involves a woman known only as Mrs. R. Heitfeld. And as Stringfield writes, "I was impressed by her sincerity in relating the bizarre details describing the UFO, the occupants, and the various collectible residues which she thought might relate to the case." So this case began around 2:30 a.m. when Mrs. Heitfeld woke up to get something to drink and noticed a bright light shining in through the window of her little trailer. And opening the curtains, she saw 6 lights, blue and silverish, hovering only about 4 feet off the ground, pretty much directly outside her window. She said they were, quote, "like stars as beautiful as Christmas lights, lit up inside." Strangely, she said they cast no illumination around them. But at this point, she looked past the lights to a car parked about 10 feet away, and this is when she saw, quote, "an ape-like creature." She said it appeared to be interested in this car. Freaking out, she ran to her son's bedroom and screamed for him to wake up and look outside. Now, he did not wake up immediately. He was sleeping pretty heavily. So she ran back to the window and saw that this ape-like creature was now about 35 feet away and was encased in a dome of light. She's not sure if this was a solid object or what, but it looked like it. She said she saw this creature in a side view profile. It appeared to have a grayish body, what looked like a snout, no visible neck, and a thick waist. She said its arms were moving very slowly up and down, kind of stiffly, almost robotic-like, not moving the elbows at all. She said it almost looked like it was trying to move a lever, though she couldn't see any visible panels or controls, but it did look like a glass dome or a shield was encasing this creature. This dome was about 15 feet wide, and again there was nothing in it but this strange figure. And finally, at this point, Mrs. Heitfeld's son, Carl, stumbled sleepily up to the window, and he saw it too. He saw the whole thing. He verified it later to Leonard Stringfield. But at this point, with this craft and this being still there right outside her home, she called the police, who were very uncooperative and skeptical. They told her, listen, we just went there. There was a fire alarm. We were called to the site. There's nothing there. And she told them that she was seeing a UFO and the occupant. She said, it's still here, and it can't be human. But the police were skeptical and uncooperative, and she hung up on them because at this point, she wanted to go back and see what this craft was doing. So at this point, a car pulled up to this first car where this all was taking place, and apparently it was there to give this car a battery jump. And when she returned to the window and saw all this, of course the creature and the craft were gone. She ran back to the police officer and told him, never mind, to the phone to tell the police officer, told him, never mind, it's gone, and hung up on him. So Mrs. Heitfeld estimates that this encounter lasted for a total of about 5 minutes. Later, she was able to locate the people who jumped this car, and they said no, they hadn't seen anything unusual, and that the car itself was already having problems. But when morning arrived the next day, she did go out there to where this craft had been, and she found this weird swirl of ashes and little bits of debris. She collected them and turned them over to Leonard Stringfield, hoping for an analysis, which unfortunately was never done. But there was another strange thing, because as it turned out, a fire alarm at the warehouse next door had been triggered by what ended up being unknown causes at the exact time of the encounter. So that seems to be a direct relation here. At any rate, the witness said that the experience itself was very frightening. She had never believed in such things as UFOs, and she called the police because she was afraid that this creature might actually come into her trailer. And Leonard Stringfield came away absolutely convinced that this was a genuine encounter. As he writes, I believe that she had a real conscious experience and was witness to an unusual anomaly beyond her ability to understand. The incident was not a hoax. Her descriptive phraseology to compare the unconventional to familiar objects lends credence to her endeavor to relate the truth. The electromagnetic effects are in the time frame of her observation as confirmed by the fire department, and the powdered substance is in my possession and available for analysis. I'm glad that case was investigated by Leonard Stringfield. He's a very well-respected researcher, I think, very thorough. He certainly did his job in investigating this case, and it's got some weird elements to it. Yeah, there are a number of cases where people have seen sort of ape-like beings, but in connection with UFOs, that's pretty rare. And now we move to the next case, which has probably even stranger looking ETs. I call this case the tiny doll-like aliens. This took place on September 3rd, 1976 in an area known as Fence Houses. This is in England. There are 2 witnesses. It's quite a close-up case. I mean, one of the witnesses actually walked right up to the craft and touched it with her own hand. That's super rare. Also, some interesting physiological effects. There's an interesting aftermath to this case as well, in that it was apparently being covered up or the witnesses being silenced. Just a really unusual case. There are two witnesses in this case, a 63-year-old grandmother and her 18-year-old niece. They had just finished visiting relatives and were walking by the little village of fence houses when they noticed a small and very strange object resting on the ground. They estimate it was about 5 feet wide, 3.5 to 4 feet wide, oval in shape. They said it had a glass-like compartment, a bright orange dome on top, and chrome-like metallic runners, kind of like you'd see on a sled. But seeing this object on the ground was strange enough, but the high strangeness quickly escalated. But because upon seeing it, both witnesses had no fear, but they immediately felt like they went into this weird hypnotic trance and couldn't help but approach the object, which of course they did. And as they got close to it, other weird things started to happen. It had been a pretty windy day, but now the wind completely stopped. Also, the traffic on the road disappeared. Later they would discover that their watches also stopped. And the grandmother walked right up to this craft and actually touched it. She walked alongside it, running her hand along the surface. She said it was very smooth, like glass, and felt warm. And it was at this point that two tiny humanoids appeared. They reminded both the witnesses of little dolls. That's what they looked like. These entities were no more than 1.5 feet tall. They looked human, or humanoid, they said, but had long white hair down to their shoulders, parted down the middle, very large eyes, and what looked like claw-like fingers. And as the grandmother says, they were just like little dolls, only 18 inches tall, sporting long white hair parted down the middle, and huge staring eyes like marbles. Now at this point, both witnesses reported that something weird was going on with time. It felt like time stopped. At this point, they did become afraid. They held their hands to their faces. And at this point, they became also very confused and disoriented. And the next thing they knew, these little doll-like figures had disappeared. This craft was now humming loudly, and it quickly took off upward at great speed. So terrified, they fled the site, and they later, of course, discovered that their watches were now working normally, but had stopped. But one weird after effect is almost inexplicable, because it was the very next day the grandmother decided to vacuum the house, and she was trying to plug the vacuum cleaner cord into an electrical socket and felt some weird force pushing her hands away from the light socket. And she tried several times, but still couldn't do it. And she eventually had to get her daughter to do it, who was able to do it with no problem. So perhaps there was some weird electromagnetic force, her bioelectric field perhaps had been altered in some way. Hard to say, but this is something we see in these encounters. Both the witnesses were very reluctant to talk. In fact, the story reached investigators only through a series of fortunate circumstances, and the whole affair ended on a very strange note when researchers discovered that they knew somebody whose partner was apparently a secret government UFO agent who worked for the Department of Defense, and told the person, his partner, that, quote, an old lady and her niece had an encounter with what looked like an egg on skids and two alien beings. So at this point, this encounter had not been publicized at all, and yet he's telling all of these details. And this person who knew him, I guess I'll call him a whistleblower, she said that she believed that her partner was, quote, trying to get to the UFO witnesses before investigators like yourselves, and destroying evidence before it got any further. And according to this lady, her former partner was reportedly very well paid. He owned a flashy new sports car and a new van and would have repeated visits from apparent government men. And he became quite abrasive and truculent, disagreeable when the whistleblower, the lady, brought up this information. And as Jenny Randles writes, there are also strange reasons why this case was never properly studied and clear evidence that the witnesses were silent. So judge for yourself what this means. Yeah, that has to be one of the stranger cases on record. The weird electromagnetic effects that occurred afterward are totally inexplicable. I don't even know how to explain that. But I'm glad it was investigated by researchers from England, even though the investigation was somewhat cut short because the main witnesses were quite frightened about and were apparently being silenced. So an extraordinary case in that regard. And now we move on to the next case, which is an on-board encounter, quite an unusual one. I call this one a trucker abducted. And that's certainly how he felt. This one took place on August 28, 1979, outside of Winchester, Virginia. And what's interesting about this case is it was very thoroughly researched. It involves some profound electromagnetic effects, some really profound after effects in terms of how this witness was affected medically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, psychically. So some really profound aspects to this case, which is not super well known and definitely deserves to be, and that's why I wanted to present it to you today. This is such a strange case. Again, August 28, 1979, outside of Winchester, Virginia. The main witness, Harry Joe Turner, is an ex-Navy sharpshooter, a welder and a plumber, a 254-pound amateur boxer with 24 wins, a martial arts student, and a truck driver. So a pretty tough guy, though none of this prepared him for what happened to him on that rainy night of August 28. He was en route in his 80,000-pound tractor trailer, which was loaded with ketchup and mustard. And he was traveling along Route 17 from Winchester to Fredericksburg, Virginia. And this is an 80-mile trip. But he was only about 17 miles in when his journey was interrupted. The first hint of strangeness began at 11:15 when Harry Joe's CB radio began to emit strange static. At the same time, he heard a high-pitched noise. He saw strange lights in both of his side view mirrors. Both his headlights began blinking on and off. This weird high-pitched noise got louder and louder. These weird lights swept over his truck, and this is when he saw a craft come over the top of his truck cab. And it was huge. He said it was bigger than his entire truck. He heard two loud thumps on the roof of his vehicle, and he says he seemed to lose control of the steering. It was almost as if the truck was floating in the air. Now the next thing he knows, he's at the end of his route in Fredericksburg, sitting in the passenger seat. It's weird because the driver's side seatbelt was still buckled. And he's trying to reorient himself, and he instantly remembers having seen this craft. He started doing a check of his belongings. He found that his money and credit cards were untouched, but his personal belongings were scattered all over the truck. His tools were laid out on the ground next to it. His watch read 11:17, but it was obvious to him it was later than that, and checking the clock in the warehouse, he saw that it read 3 a.m. So that's about 4 hours of missing time. And looking at his odometer, this absolutely floored him. It showed that he had only driven 17 miles. But the fuel tank showed that he had actually used 114 gallons, which is several times more than what the trip required. Also, his radio antenna was sheared off. And there were other after effects. The next day he noticed that his eyes were extremely sensitive to light. His ears were sensitive to sound. Later that day he fainted and was rushed to the hospital. This is when Harry revealed his UFO experience, and he was referred to a psychiatrist. Back at home, he noticed that the gun he had carried on that trip showed that all 8 rounds had been fired. And this is when he started having flashbacks. He remembered this craft coming over, and that was when, next thing he knew, he woke up at this warehouse. But now he remembered an entity coming down to his door. He remembered firing his gun at the entity. He remembered his truck being levitated by a beam of light into this object. He found himself inside this craft. He was pulled into a room where he says he was examined by human-looking figures who were wearing kind of white shirts and pants and white caps, kind of like doctors. He said it was really strange because their foreheads had what looked like numbers on them. He says they were very pale complected, and when they moved, they darted from place to place very quickly, much more than a normal person could move. He said they surrounded him, examined him using strange tools. He thinks they may have put an implant inside of him. He said they spoke in what sounded like a recording going backwards, kind of high-speed gibberish. At one point, an entity approached Harry Joe and asked him what his name was. So Harry told them, and the entity said that his name was, phonetically speaking, Alpha Lazulu. So this entity asked him a series of questions. Harry has not been able to remember what these questions were for the most part, but he does remember the ETs asking him about his truck's transmission, which was an unusual transmission. So Harry Joe says his memory came back in bits and pieces. At one point he does recall seeing a strange star-like symbol on board the craft. He also remembered being taken to what he believes is another planet with big domes on them, which were covering large cities. He says, quote, in a land that looks like the future of this planet. So he had the impression that they had suffered some kind of nuclear war, though apparently he was not directly told this. He says at some point when he was being returned, they took him to the surface of the Earth's moon, close enough to see the footprints left by the astronauts. I found this interesting because a number of contactees do report this kind of thing. But the whole encounter left him pretty badly traumatized. Before it, he had been a moderate smoker, but he began smoking heavily. He started taking sedatives to handle his anxiety. He began suffering from sudden crying spells. He says he heard this ringing in his ears. He believed that the ETs were looking through his eyes. The encounter actually left him very emotionally depressed, to the point of, on occasion, being suicidal. It was 10 days following this encounter, he felt compelled to return to the site where he had been taken. So he went there, and he was apparently taken again. He doesn't have all the memories of this, but as Harry says, they told me they wouldn't take nothing aboard their ship unless it was sterilized. I asked them, where were we going? And they said, nowhere. We only need you for a moment, and we're done with you now. Of the ETs, Harry does not believe that they're malevolent or evil. As he says, they want to help us, but they say things have gone pretty far here, and the end is coming soon. So that's certainly a theme we hear a lot in communications with ETs. But the weird events continued. According to Harry Joe, he says at one point he was visited by what he describes as sort of a Jesus-like figure. This caused him to become more religious. He was traumatized to the point that he began sleeping with a gun under his pillow. Again, he doesn't feel that the ETs are bad or harmful, and he says given the opportunity, he would definitely go back on board. He says following his encounter, he began having all kinds of paranormal experiences with ESP and what sounds like remote viewing. And there's other weird things that happened. He created a file and started documenting his experiences and putting all the evidence he had gathered in it. But in December of that year, it came up missing, along with his Navy records, his birth certificate, and a UFO questionnaire he had filled out. So there are some who know him who question his credibility, but all of them agree that something very unusual and traumatic happened to him. And as Harry himself says, ever since it all began, I've just been sitting here going over and over it in my mind, trying to piece things back together. I'd feel pretty good if I could just figure out where I've been. If somebody would just come up to me and say I was drunk or something, that would be great, because it would give me an explanation, a reason. But I wasn't drunk. Nothing makes sense. So that's certainly something I have heard from other UFO experiencers who have told me personally, I wish you would have just said I was crazy. That would be an explanation. But no, I don't think these people are crazy. Too many people are having this kind of experience. That's another case where I really feel for the witness because he obviously had a very hard time dealing with this, which is not unusual and understandable, I think, particularly if an encounter takes someone by surprise. But an important case for the reasons I stated, how the physical evidence and how this witness was affected afterwards. And now we move to the last case of this collection, which actually comes from Russia. And I call this one E.T. Phone Home. Don't mean to be cliche, but as you shall see, there's an interesting element to this case where I think that title is appropriate. This one took place on July 4, 1989 in Tbilisi, Georgia. This is in Russia, of course. And it's a super interesting case that was investigated by experienced researchers and has some interesting corroborations and some truly unusual elements to it, as we shall see. This case, another onboard experience, comes from the Georgian Ufological Association. The witness is largely anonymous, known only as David D. And it was around 9:30 p.m. on July 4th, 1989, and he was driving along the Matak-Minda Road in Ordachala, and suddenly his car engine failed. And David says he felt himself being overcome by a strange, invisible sort of force field, which compelled him to walk about 600 feet down the road. And he walked right up to a landed flying saucer. And as David says, in his own words, it was standing to the left of me and had 3 legs. All around it were colored lights. At the bottom were stairs and illuminated windows. From this saucer, 15 to 20 meters away, were standing 4 figures. They were 2.53 meters in height. So that's tall. I mean, that's up to 9 feet. And as David says, I wasn't scared, maybe because of that hypnosis-like force, which was taking me to that place, kept me from being scared. They were also not afraid when they saw me. One of them came close to me and tried to establish contact. I was trying to understand. First he was talking in this strange language. Next, he started talking in Russian. He asked, "How old am I?" I answered. Next he told me that they aren't the first here and they will come again. He told me, "We come when it is a necessity." He said that we are undeveloped and that we have simple, primitive technology. Next, I felt behind me something warm. I turned and saw that one of them was measuring my height. Talking to only one of them, I put my hand on my watch and gave a sign that I was late and I am in a hurry. He asked, "Do you have a phone at home?" I answered, "I have, but how can I call from here?" He went into the saucer, walked up a gangway where the light was coming from, and when he came back he held a strange apparatus. The device was lit up with different colored lights and strange signs, which looked like hieroglyphs. I understood that it was a phone, and I dialed my home number. The voice that was coming from the apparatus and light which lit up from the voice, understood me, that nobody was taking my phone call at home. Then he took the apparatus back without speaking. Afterwards, he came back and told that they want to take us. I don't understand what they mean by us, that they want to help, that they aren't coming with a bad intention. I asked, what if I come with you? Will you bring me back? He didn't answer because on the small transmitter, in my mind it was a transmitter, all four of them had it on their breasts, was a lighted red-colored bulb, and I heard a low siren-like voice. When he heard that signal, he went into the saucer and took me with him. Inside the saucer, I saw a TV-like apparatus. I saw all of my body. The picture was color and clearer than on an X-ray set. I saw how my heart worked, my stomach, and other organs. At that time, my interrogator came back. He told me that I was free and I can go home. I said, my car isn't working. He calmed me and said, don't worry, your car will be okay. I came back and sat in the car. I saw how the UFO pushed the stairs in and lifted into the air. Approximately at 60 meters altitude, it reduced speed, turned on its side, and climbed into the air. I heard a low humming sound. The car started, and I went to home. So all of these details are quite interesting because they're certainly reported in a lot of other cases in terms of how this craft rose up, turned on its side, and darted off silently. That's very commonly reported. Of course, a car failing, being hypnotically compelled to go to a craft. All of these details are quite commonly reported, though this telephone-like instrument, I've not heard that before. But later, the witness did go back and found some weird evidence. As he says, on July 11, at the same place, I saw a black spilled liquid, which had an oil smell. I want to tell you that the liquid on the third day wasn't there. Consequently, after our meeting, they were there once more at the same spot, and they stayed that time. So again, this was investigated by a Russian UFO group, and they found out that 1 week later, a scientist and her daughter saw a UFO sending down a beam of light in that exact same area. Certainly a very bizarre case. I think you'll agree that's a very interesting case, quite unusual, with corroborating witnesses supporting it afterwards. A lot to learn from that case, which, yeah, is more unusual perhaps than most, but as I've often said, high strangeness seems to be a regular aspect of these encounters. And on the other hand, high strangeness is kind of our own interpretation of it. Only seems strange because we don't fully understand it. So that's our show for today. I hope you found this very interesting and hopefully educational. As I've said many times, this is a global phenomena. It stretches back, I think, millennia, but it's pretty clear people have been directly contacted for decade after decade after decade. And we're seeing a wide variety of humanoids, but almost always humanoids. And again, all kinds of evidence to back these cases up. It's certainly not just one person's testimony. A lot of these cases have multiple eyewitness testimony and the whole variety of effects we see, from medical effects to animal reactions to electromagnetic disturbances, and most significantly, I think, landing traces. So always a lot of questions and mysteries surrounding all of this, but I think we're making really good progress in understanding and getting close to accepting the fact that we are not alone, that we are being visited, and that we are only one of many different humanoids in this universe. And that is awesome. So again, that's it for today. Thanks so much. I truly appreciate you watching, and until next time, keep searching for answers, keep looking for the truth, and most important, keep having fun. Bye now.